Causal factors are much better placed at the material and structural.
It's not as bad as the other move, which is the only reason you're doing this is because you lack willpower and you lack impulse control. That's worse, right? Over-moralizing.
Hey, what up, everybody? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And this week we were supposed to have a guest, but she's sick. So Heidi, I know you sometimes listen to the podcast, so get well soon so we can delve into some sick stuff. But then Troy and I were chatting and we were like, well, what could we do to salvage this week's episode? And there was a recent study that came out that's kind of been, making the rounds on social media? Is that how you would put it?
Yeah, there has to be like a new metaphor for going around the interwebs like that, though. I don't
going
like making
through?
the rounds.
Yeah, it's not making the rounds. It's being bandied about.
Who was that
bouncing.
politician that was like, that thought the inner tubes were like actual tubes and the things get stuck in there?
Yeah, wasn't it George Bush?
No, I don't think it was someone like that prominent. But there has to be like to reverse that metaphor. So it's like it's unclogged through the tubes or something, or like it's racing through the tubes.
Yes, it's racing through the tubes. So this is a study. It's a revamped look at the marshmallow study, the famous marshmallow study. And it's come to some surprising, or some psychologists have come to some surprising new conclusions. And so Troy and I are going to chat about that, as well as like a bevy of other literature that surrounds the marshmallow test. So that's what we're going to delve into this week.
But before we do that, we have to go through the first segment of the show, which is the Shitty Minute. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's grinding our gears and making life miserable this week. So Austin, what's got you all messed up inside?
What's got my panties in a bunch?
That's what I was going for, yeah. That's kind of sexist, so.
I was going to say, were you trying to be #MeToo sensitive?
Yeah, you never know who our new listeners are, so you got to be careful.
That is very true.
You know, we are the most likely not to offend.
That's right. All right. So, as you know, Troy, I have recently relocated to the Southern Hemisphere. And things are weird here. Things are backwards in the Southern Hemisphere. The water goes down the drain in a different direction. Seasons are reversed. So it's a little confusing. And I'll be honest, I don't like the fact that it's June and it's winter. This is wrong. This is not the way that God intended it to be. The Northern Hemisphere is the way that God intended it to be. You know how I know this? Because there's a motherfucking song called White Christmas, not called White July. And in Australia, they don't have White Christmas. You want to know why? Because they have Summer Christmas. And that is just naturally an affront to the metaphysical principles that God intended for the universe. So fuck the Southern Hemisphere, man. What is up with this shit? That's my shitty minute this week.
Yeah, I mean, you think that if God cared about so much about the date, he would have made the Earth not this way, first of all, right?
Well, first of all, we know that the Earth is flat. We have an episode on this anyway, which we actually don't think the Earth is flat, but we did talk about flat earthers. So if you want to check that shit out, it's in the back catalog. But yeah, what would it be? Would it just be a big square?
Well, I mean, yeah.
Big
why
cube?
Why did God send Jesus to the Northern Hemisphere? Like, what the hell? That's some Northern aggression right there.
Yeah, exactly. It's called dependency theory in world political strategies, right? It's where you extract that the reason that the Northern Hemisphere is as ahead as it is because it's able to extract resources from the Southern Hemisphere, and so developing nations and third world nations in old parlance are dependent upon these other nations, and there's this sort of like correlation between the two. It's because, God was trying to establish the metaphysical grounds for dependency theory.
So yeah, if you wanted to get ahead in life, should have been born in the Northern Hemisphere, bitches.
That's right. And if you're born in the Southern Hemisphere, you got a lot of ground to make up. But for real, man, for real, I was actually, so there's this event here in Sydney that's called Vivid Sydney, and it's when like Darling Harbour and the Opera House and the bridge in the Sydney Harbour, they're all lit up, and all these other crazy buildings in downtown are lit up. It's actually quite stellar, the sort of just from an aesthetic perspective, these crazy neon lights and things like that. And so it lasts for about a month, and I was walking around there the other night, and I was just thinking to myself, because, it's like winter, and it had that Christmas feeling, like like I'm used to, where the lights are out at Christmas time and it's a little bit nippy out and there's music playing and there's a bunch of people out, wearing gloves and scarves and drinking their warm beverages. And I was like, oh, this kind of has a Christmas feeling. And then I stopped and caught myself and I was like, it's fucking June 3rd, man. Like this is not the way it should be. And then I got really confused and I was thinking, wait, Australians, they can't even sing White Christmas authentically. Like for them, it's just a lie. They can only sing Sunny Christmas? Like, and do they have Sunny Christmas songs? I don't know. I haven't been here for Christmas yet, so I'll have to report back later. But it's just all fucked up, man. It's all fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how I deal with that, given that, I love the fall and the kind of early winter. It's one of my favorite times of the year. And all the holidays and everything kind of circling around that. It would be really hard to adjust to doing that stuff in the middle of summer.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't done it yet, but it just in my imagination, it's really weird. It's really weird. I don't know. And even though we're from Southern California, so it's not like we've actually like been surrounded by the white Christmas. It does get colder.
Hey, it gets to like 68, so it's pretty damn cold.
And we have Santa's Village in the San Gabriel Mountains that we used to go to as kids. Did you ever go to that?
Yeah.
I don't think it's there anymore. But, Santa's Village, where there's a little bit of snowfall and they have like the reindeer and the Santa and the Christmas trees. And all of the Christmas trees are out and they're like covered in fake snow and stuff like that. So at least we can play with the fantasy. Whereas here, I mean, it doesn't even make sense to have like a tree that's flocked with the fake snow, because that's not even something that they would care about except by watching movies or listening to songs, right? Because they don't give a fuck about White Christmas because they don't have the same significance attached to it.
So I get why today you would need, for commercial reasons, to have Christmas the same time as the rest of the world does, the rest of the Christian world does. But did anybody previous to the inventions of like radio and TV and the internet and stuff argue that Australia should just have Christmas in like June or July?
I mean, yeah, because it was like a reclamation of the winter solstice, right?
Yeah, so the date December 25th has really nothing to do with when Jesus was probably actually born. So like, why not just change it to whatever you want it to be?
Well, and if you think about the preponderance of Christians that actually live in the Southern Hemisphere, when you consider Latin America, then it makes you think even further. Like, well, why didn't they invert the seasons so that they could go for, I don't know, I guess would it be their winter solstice down here? Is that the deal? Or how does that? Dude, I'm so confused right now. Like in the June, July months, is that their winter solstice? Is that what they call it?
I don't even know. You need to find out about this.
What the fuck? Oh my god, I'm so confused.
Well, yeah, they would
now.
have to have a winter solstice based upon the cycles.
But is that what they call it, or do they call it something else?
Yeah, I don't know what they would call it.
Right. Or is it like the June, July equinox still?
Yeah, but I mean, since it's winter, they would have to call it winter solstice, right? Or it's at least the equivalent to the winter solstice.
Fuck, man, I don't know. I don't know.
You need to follow up on this next week.
Yeah, see, this is weird. I will say this. There's actually this really cool YouTube video speaking about the difference between like southern and northern hemisphere polarities and magnetism and things like that as well, with like the water moving in the opposite direction. And it's this dude, I think he's in Nigeria. It's somewhere on the African continent that's right on the equatorial line. And there are these 3 water buckets that are set up. One that's on the side on the northern hemisphere, one that's across on the southern hemisphere, and one that's right on the equatorial line. And this dude puts like water in this bucket, and then he undoes the drain, undoes the plug. And obviously the water in the northern hemisphere spins one way, the southern hemisphere it spins another way. And then on the equatorial line, it just goes straight down. It doesn't rotate. It's fucking crazy, man.
That would be creepy.
It's really cool. Yeah, and apparently you weigh 3% less on the equatorial line as well. So so fucking weird.
Have you seen the classic Simpsons episode where I think it's at Homer's in Australia, and they build this really elaborate like Rube Goldberg contraption on the toilet to make it spin the American way, and then when it's doing it for the first time, he salutes and like starts crying.
No,
that was from like the mid '90s, and it's probably the best encapsulation of like current politics in America right now. As we're fighting over who's allowed to be on TV and how you salute the flag and shit like that, if it's the paragon of politics.
Yeah, God, amazing.
right, so for our main segment today, we're talking about some recent articles that have been released based upon the famous marshmallow test studies, which was done a while ago. Do you know when the first marshmallow test was done? Several
It
decades
was
ago,
done in the
right?
yeah, well, it was done in the '60s, and then they followed up with people decades later and stuff like that.
Right, that's kind of when it took on the larger, social and
The
political.
'90s was when it really took on like the larger implications. I think actually in 1990.
Yeah, so let's first talk about what the original marshmallow test was, and then how it was sort of recast in the '90s when the research was followed up on. So the marshmallow test, the basic idea was that these social psychologists took a number of, they were what, like 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, kids basically, and
Mm-hmm.
they gave them an option between taking one marshmallow immediately or waiting 5 minutes and getting two marshmallows. And there's been variants done. I think one of the articles we talked about previously, Austin, was they took M&Ms, and you could have one now or have several in a few minutes.
Right.
And the point of it was just to measure and sort of confirm the hypothesis that the older kids got, the more they were able to delay gratification. And they found exactly that, as expected. 2 and 3-year-olds were less likely to be able to wait 5 minutes. They wanted the M&Ms now, and the older kids were generally more able to delay gratification and wait a few minutes to get them more marshmallows and the more M&Ms or whatever it was. And that's not surprising. I think everyone would kind of expect that based on what we know about children's ability to delay gratification and have willpower and all that kind of stuff. The interesting point was when they followed up on this, as you're saying, in the '90s, and found out these same kids, when they were adults, had a strong correlation between the kids who were unable to delay gratification, that took the immediate marshmallow and couldn't wait for the more marshmallows later, and their lower SAT scores. They had less financial success, all sorts of other kind of negative outcomes that were
Higher
correlated.
BMI too. Their obesity
Yeah,
levels
obesity levels were
higher.
much higher as well. So all these things we'd associate as negative outcomes were strongly correlated with the marshmallow test originally. And so this finding has been a pretty huge reference point for a lot of people in talking about how or why people are poor, why people are obese, and kind of producing a causal argument there between a lack of individual personal willpower and these negative outcomes, which trades on this whole kind of personal responsibility angle that you see bandied about a lot in political discourse. Is that a pretty good
Mm.
kind of encapsulation of how it's been used, do you think?
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is the tests, the implications cover policy decisions. Economists, particularly neoclassical economists, have used the marshmallow test to reinforce or justify levels of inequality and the virtues of saving as opposed to spending, which is something that fits within certain neoclassical models of economic theory. So there are a lot of things that have been drawn from this initial study, and then of course I think there's also been some confusions as well about the intention of the original study, actually what took place in the original study, and so these updated experiments are kind of interesting because they're refining things, but I think at the same time they're also building on some misunderstandings from the original study as well. One of which was, is I recently was just reading about one of the sort of original guys that started this in the '60s with his grad students. His name is, hold on, let me just get it real quick here. Walter Mischel
Yeah.
is his name, and so Mischel actually was saying that one thing we need to understand is that in the initial study, the marshmallows that were offered weren't like these huge big marshmallows that you often see in commercials and on YouTube videos and things like that. They were these tiny, like meaningless marshmallows, or sometimes they were even those like little stick pretzels that are less than an inch tall. And sometimes he says they had nothing to do with sweets whatsoever, but they were actually poker chips. So it was one poker chip versus two poker chips. And he says, and the reason that this is significant is what a lot of researchers have missed is that it's less about like the dopamine rush that is immediately experienced from candy and from sweets and how there's this correlation between children and wanting sweets, but that a lot of it was just simply about achievement in relation to the authority figure that person had a trust relationship with. So they wanted to make sure that the person that was that was instituting the exam had a trust relationship with the child, so they would play with the child quite a bit, or there would be some familiarity with the child beforehand. So it wasn't about whether or not there was trust in the promise that was offered, but rather it was more about how would this child feel accomplished because they achieved the goal in relation to pleasing the authority figure, whether it was the person administering the quote unquote test, but then he doesn't like the word test, but let's say the study, or like the parent. And he says that a lot of the kids actually said things like, oh my gosh, my mom will be so proud of me, or something like that. So there's this interesting relation between the authority figure and the sort of the pleasure that is achieved by satisfying the expectations that the child feels is demanded, which is kind of a little bit different than how the test has kind of been interpreted over the years. But I think that's interesting to at least consider at the outset.
Yeah, I think the one lesson you can definitely take from this is, I think my biggest issue with how the marshmallow test is used is just our tendency to take kind of pop science articles that you read, and whether it's Scientific American or The Atlantic or even, whatever source you find them, and then use them to justify whatever causal relationship you already think is the case. And
Right.
and I kind of fear that we do this even when we talk about it in this negative fashion, and say you shouldn't use studies to justify preconceived notions, especially ones that haven't been replicated many times. It can, in every avenue. This is just how kind of human reasoning works: is we have pre-established judgments, and then we look and try to find anything to justify them. And when it justifies our pre-established judgments, we don't look further into the actual issue, because we've already gotten the sort of reward we want from it. And when it doesn't confirm our pre-established judgments, we look into it so much that we end up finding whatever possible problem we can have with it, and then sort of dismissing it as no longer relevant.
Hmm.
And obviously, the marshmallow test is a social psychology experiment, right? And
Right.
social psychology has a fairly renowned history of not being able to replicate the results of studies over time. What is it? Something like
Right.
50%? I think it's maybe more than 50% of social psychology experiments that have been published in professional journals have not been able to be replicated.
Hmm.
So, and that's not to say that social psychology is bullshit. It's not. It's just really, really difficult to tease out correlation from causation. And you can't just
Right.
rely upon single instances to do that. And then you add on top of that our sort of irrational tendency to justify our pre-established ideas and judgments, and you have just a cauldron of misdirected thinking.
Yeah, that's the thing that I thought was the issue of the relation between correlation and causation is something that, as I was like rereading a couple of articles about the revised publication that came out with these new findings, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about in a minute, and then some of the sort of replications of these type of gratification tests or these achievement studies or whatever you want to call them over the past few years, was this problem precisely of correlation and causation. And it seems that you'll read these articles and a lot of times they'll say like, oh, well, so what this test suggests is that if you delay gratification, then such and such and such and such. Or what this suggests is people delay gratification when they exhibit such and such characteristics, right? Like they're impulsive or they're not impulsive, or they have willpower or they don't have willpower, or whatever the causal factor might be. And it just seems so interesting that even though they're trying to use the word suggest rather than like clearly demonstrates or proves or something like that, it seems to indicate it's still a little too heavy-handed almost, right? It seems a little bit too leading for 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 maybe a better way to kind of take what these type of tests actually demonstrate or what they actually express. And I know that it's not that they're trying to mislead or anything like that, but they are very misleading, especially when you don't read the actual journal article itself, but you read, you know, Pop Psychology Today or whatever, The Guardian or whatever this is. Like if you just Google right now marshmallow test or like new marshmallow test, you will get 1,000 different articles from 1,000 different publications, from journal outlets to kind of like, I mean, I don't even know, what do you call like Psychology Today? It's not a news outlet. It's like a psychology publication, popular publication, whatever the fuck it is. And you'll find all of these commentaries on the study rather than the actual study itself. Now, you may find links to it, but what percentage of the population are actually going to go and click the link and read the actual study? So there's a lot of problem with dissemination of information and translation as well. And a lot of times, as with anything, when we're distilling information, we're filtering it through an interpretive grid, and so you miss a lot of the actual first order information. And then on top of that, and then even if you were able to access the first order information, there'd still be problems as well. So you also have a problem of translation and interpretation here as well that seems to bear on a lot of these results.
Yeah. I mean, we can go all day talking about journalism. I mean, the idea, science journalism, just in general, has these weird conflicting incentives, right? Because if you're a journalist, usually if you're writing for the Washington Post or the Journal or the New York Times or whatever it is, or even pop psychology stuff like Psychology Today or Scientific American or whatever, your job is to get clicks, right? That's how you justify getting paid by the company. And so, are you really gonna avoid being heavy-handed and be really nuanced and properly replicate what's being said in the studies and in the journal articles that you're referencing? Well, I mean, doing that and being really careful and nuanced isn't going to get you clicks. So it doesn't mean you're like outright lying or trying to, like, in a dastardly way, misuse the scientific evidence that's you've been presented with. But you're probably going to have to write the article in such a way that it's not really just being a courier for the scientific evidence. It's more like trying to make a point with it, which can be good. Certainly there's a place for that, right? But it can also open up all sorts of avenues for misuse and mischaracterization, and then outright bad faith in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing is I've been dealing with this recently as well. I'm working on an article for a more popular print or online publication, and when I've got notes back from the editor, a lot of it was taking my nuance and maybe my kind of pussyfooting around certain ideas or topics and saying, well, just say this more directly like this or like this. And then when I read the direct statement, my impulse is kind of like, well, but that's not really what I want to say. I want to navigate around. I want to like work within this constellation of meaning or this matrix or this network rather than simply trying to make these bolder claims. And maybe this is the pitfall of being a philosopher, but I'm not as comfortable making these more defined rhetorical points. But the journalism world doesn't function like that. Like, it's about just simply making these simple statements more than it is about teasing out ideas and stimulating thought and working through potential implications and things like that, which is unfortunate because bringing it back to the marshmallow experiment, I mean, the thing that's interesting about it is that it doesn't just simply tell you about human nature, but rather what it does is it is one instance under very particular controlled circumstances that demonstrates one very select set of human parameters that may indicate certain tendencies in human behavior. And what I just said is, again, like, that sentence would not fly in a journal
And no one
article.
wants to read that shit.
No, I do. Yeah, like qualifications on top of qualifications and like subtle nods. They don't want that.
Yeah, in any scientific article you read, they're going to make a claim like that, right? Very nuanced and careful, and then suggest further avenues for study to actually go ahead and try and find the answers to those sort of more nuanced questions that they're asking. But that's not the kind of thing you're going to see in a pop science article. Yeah, and that even gets to kind of the root of our tendency, our need to have these monocausal explanations for giant phenomena, right? When you see that crime rates are rising in a certain area, you want a monocausal explanation. There's one thing causing that. It's because there's more guns, or it's because there's poverty in a certain area, or because it's one of these major things. And sure, there's going to be some causal relationship between those things, most likely, right? And you could even do some experiments and do some studies and find out that there's some causal relationship. But the key there is that it's some. There's some causal relationship, just like there's some causal relationship between smoking and getting lung cancer. Just because one
Mm,
person doesn't get lung cancer doesn't mean that there's no causal relationship. And just because someone does get lung cancer from smoking doesn't mean they got it only because they were smoking.
mm,
Monocausal explanations for especially group phenomena are pretty much always problematic. Not necessarily the case,
mm.
but generally you can't just have one single cause, especially for group phenomena. So when you talk about how, millennials tend to be more risk taking or more impulsive or more whatever, attributing that to something that's monocausal generally is just going to be off the mark.
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the articles that I read, and I think I sent it to you. Were you able to read it? The one that was on millennials?
Yeah, you sent this to me about 10 minutes before we started, so I perused it real quick.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just found it. And I was interested in it because one of the things that it suggests is that a lot of the a lot of the implications drawn from the initial study was based on this idea of willpower and impulse, right? And so the argument basically goes those who were unable to delay gratification did so because of a lack of impulse control. So they were just simply more impulsive. And then the reason then that these same individuals suffered later in life and got lower SAT scores and didn't fare as well in the financial market and had higher BMI indexes was precisely because of this impulse problem. And so there have been subsequent studies that have actually shown that, as a matter of fact, under these situations, under the conditions of the marshmallow experiment, the choice to delay gratification versus not delaying gratification actually has very little to do with impulse control, and that the decision to not delay gratification versus the decision to delay gratification are actually made oftentimes under the same biological, what would you say, states or intensities of stress, which is an indicator of impulse control. And that actually, so what that means then is that the decision to not delay gratification is a calm and quote unquote rational decision, according to the measures that were at least examined under these subsequent studies. So this one article then goes on to say that one of the problems is that people are trying to claim that, well, millennials are suffering from saving and they're suffering from the conditions of the job market, not because the structural conditions that are impinging upon them, but because of their lack of impulse control and because they have like this deficiency within this generation because they're selfish. It's the me generation or whatever. And this article actually says, well, to the contrary, that if we take all of our kind of these factors under consideration and we recognize that they are actually potentially making calm, rational decisions to not delay gratification, to not save for retirement, but rather that they'd rather go on a fucking trip to Thailand now and get those Instagram photos so that they can share with their friends or so that they can get the life experiences now rather than trying to save for retirement, is because maybe they don't believe in the myth, if you will, of gratification that comes from saving, based on the idea that after the collapse of 2008, that even if you do save, you might not ever get to experience the gratification that comes from that because $40 trillion of national wealth or of international wealth, of global wealth was wiped out in an instant, which means that you can save and save and save forever, but you still might get fucked because the structural conditions aren't necessarily conducive to actually giving you the promise that it was hanging over your head.
Yeah, it's the bird in the hand's worth more than two in the bush logic, kind of taken to the
Mm,
extreme. And yeah, I think the point there isn't to replace one monocausal explanation for another. I think the real point there is just to say, look, to assume that people are just being irrational or impulsive or kind of animalistic in these ways is pretty naive. But people, especially
mm,
for larger and repeated decisions in their lives, they have a psychological rationalization for why they're doing what they're doing. Whether you agree with it or
mm,
not, whether you would do the same or not, try and find out what that is. And so if people are generally, otherwise smart people are delaying or are refusing to delay gratification and not saving for retirement, not doing all the things that the baby boomers did and generally had success with, try and find out why that's the case and look at the structural factors that may impinge on that rather than just assuming. I mean, I think we're sort of making a caricature, but the idea that the millennials are impulsive because they're millennials is something you do hear a lot, even though I think it's
Mm,
such a bad argument as to be not even really worth addressing, as if generations are things that have characteristics rather than just
right.
arbitrary groupings of individuals. That's basically astrology for adults, right? Generalization critique or characterizations. So yeah, I mean, I tend just to say that that could be just dismissed as totally not worth discussion. But you see things that are similar to that in mainstream publications and stuff, and so it's worth at least exploring why it's so problematic.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and then so basically the article that is, what is it? Zooming through the interwebs, the tubes on the internet. What did we
I
say?
like zooming better than racing, actually.
Okay, it's the article that's zooming through the interwebs, the intertubes, is actually kind of takes the focus off of the individuals and the focus off of, let's say, impulse control or willpower. It rejects the conclusions that we might call that rest on subjects of cognition and shifts it to structural conditions. And these new findings actually try to suggest that, in fact, individuals who delay gratification versus those who do not map on quite well to particular socioeconomic tiers. And it's just so interesting that, I mean, obviously now maybe you and I gravitate to these findings because it fits with our penchant for structural
Oh,
critique, material
absolutely.
structural critique. But it really does, is that's exactly what these new findings indicate, is that causal factors are much better placed at the material and structural rather than just simply the autonomous subject of cognition or the autonomous subject of will. And that's what this new study is kind of, it's drawing attention to. It's drawing attention to the conditional factors that are so important in articulating why it is that certain people would delay gratification. Basically, if you have more material comfort, if you have more of a likelihood of some sort of future experience of further gratification, then you're not going to be as eager to eat the marshmallow now because you aren't as inclined towards simply taking the thing in the moment now as somebody who isn't as accustomed to having this time and the opportunity for a sort of patient condition of reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also want to address that issue you brought up a second ago. The idea that aren't we just using this recent swab of evidence that's come out in the past couple of weeks to justify pre-established notions of structural critique and analysis as being superior to such individualistic, moralistic type of analysis that you sometimes see revolving around personal responsibility. I think that that's true, is the thing. We probably are doing
Yeah,
that. I think we
sure.
should admit that straight up. And then just to say that there's an important distinction, I think, to make between the individual and the group. And that we probably know individuals, everybody does, who are impulsive and who don't make good long term decisions and seem incapable of making good long term decisions. And that ends up
Mm.
resulting in a lot of cases with a lack of success in certain areas, whether employment or their personal life or financial or whatever. And that can be absolutely true, and you should probably address that person at the individual level, not necessarily moralize at them or anything.
Hold on, Troy. Is this another intervention, dude? Are you trying to say something to me? Like, what's up
Well, I
here?
mean, if you want to take it that way, you can take it that way.
Oh! Don't be passive aggressive, motherfucker. No.
Hey, I'm not the one who's on Wisecrack nowadays, who's made it to the big leagues, all right? I'm still down in Double A, so I'm definitely not
Oh Jesus.
rejecting your like success as being faux or anything.
Oh Jesus.
Where was that? What was I saying? Oh yeah, so if you have
You
if you know someone at
we
the
know people at the individual level.
yeah, you should
Yeah.
address them at the individual level. And sometimes it'll be at the moral level if it's the case that there's morally problematic or wrong decision making happening, or sometimes it'll be at a different individual level, right? Like at a psychological or a
Mm.
therapeutic or whatever it might be. And that's different than looking at the structural or group level, where you don't moralize for the most part. Group phenomenon are not sort of you don't add up individual moral choices and end up with a group choice. Is what I'm trying to say. It's sort of a it's not how like the mereological part to whole relationship works. And so that's why we talk about justice at the group level rather than morality, which happens more at the individual level. And I think this is a larger point that I don't really want to get to right now, but I just think generally when we're talking about issues like welfare, which is kind of where the marshmallow test usually comes up, right? Should we have social welfare models to make society better? And one side will say, well, no, that sort of hampers personal responsibility and it won't really work for that reason. Others will say, well, no, it actually enhances personal responsibility for the same reasons we're talking about today, because you'll have some sort of material abundance or safety net, and then you can actually from there on make better choices. And at the group justice level, I think it's important to just be agnostic about the moral choices, leave those for the individual level, and just focus on what's actually fair, what actually produces a form of a just society, and then work from that.
Mm.
And I think you can have a bifurcation between justice and morality and say that they're kind of like non-overlapping magisteria. I guess they are overlapping, but they don't overlap entirely for certain. And be able to talk about both of these issues, the moral and the issues of justice, while admitting that you don't have to moralize about justice and you don't have to talk about group justice at the level of individual morality. This is all a bigger point, I guess. I could do like a number of episodes on this, but it's an issue I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I think the main point that I want to get across, and tell me if you see where I'm going or if maybe you disagree, is I just don't, anytime that we talk about group justice phenomena, like should we have social welfare, and then we moralize about it, we end up into irrelevancies. And on the reverse side, and when you're talking about individual morality, when you talk about sort of the causal factors, the justice factors, those are relevant, but they're not always the most relevant, and they can obscure what individual decision making is actually happening. And so I want to introduce some sort of separation line or demarcation line between them. Do you kind of see where I'm going with that?
I mean, kinda. So if there is this sort of, if there's almost like an impasse between these two domains of reality, let's say, or domains of analysis, is the problem then ultimately, okay, so then what do we do ethically? Like, what do we do politically? And if these are two different sort of domains of reality, there's the individual moral and then the group juridical. So then how do we live together? Is that kind of the problem that this raises?
Yeah, that's absolutely the problem. And I like to think that justice is the condition of possibility for morality. It's kind of the idea that I want to work with myself. And that just means that you need to have a just society in order to be moral. And so any way in which you don't have justice, you sort of hamper or hamstring morality. This is kind of like a Platonic idea that I really like a lot.
Yeah, my only problem is that I don't like the word morality. And the reason is because it is already imbued with so much value judgment. So, for example, this marshmallow test is oftentimes called a test, right? And you either pass the test or you fail the test. And people who do not delay gratification are oftentimes viewed as the ones who fail the test. So my only worry is, and I don't know if you're saying this, but this is where my mind is going. So if justice is the condition that allows for the actuality of morality, then in this instance it would be if we have material conditions that leave people or that don't leave people for want, then that means that, of course, it's going to affect their decision making. But my problem is to call that moral is to implicitly make a judgment call on them, it seems.
That's exactly
right?
why you shouldn't call them moral, though, because they don't. It's not under unjust conditions. It is only under, unjust conditions. It's when those are under just conditions that you can then call it moral, because justice is the condition of possibility for morality in the first place. So when I'm talking about individual
So
morality.
morality doesn't exist unless justice
Well, I'm
exists.
not going to, because it's not one or the other. It's not a binary. But insofar as there is
Okay.
justice, there can then be morality, is the idea. And so no one lives under completely unjust conditions, nor does no one live under completely just conditions. It's always somewhere in between those two poles, right? And so there's a sense in
Okay.
which I think we should allow for a degree of morality insofar as someone is able to live under just conditions. And it's not just because then they only have causal agency when there's justice. I want to avoid that idea too, because you can then end up taking someone who's oppressed and then totally remove their agency from them. And I don't like that idea
Mm-hmm.
either, as if people who are oppressed have no agency. They're basically not human. It's almost like a going through the back door way of removing agency from oppressed people. So that's not
Right.
the reason. But I do think that it's important to make this distinction so that we can be aware of when structural factors are most important, and then be aware in other cases where structural factors are important but in the background. And the marshmallow test is an occasion where you're talking about group phenomena here, so we should probably have moral factors in the background and justice factors in the foreground.
And the moral factors would be the issues of impulse control and willpower and et cetera, et cetera. And the justice factors are the sort of socioeconomic or material conditions that impinge upon or that create the parameters under which the moral actions are expressed.
Yes, exactly. But it's important, I think, to avoid making a straight line of causation from the justice factors to the moral ones, right? From the structural factors of poverty and of lack of trust and of food scarcity and things like that, to then, well, then you must have been unable to delay your gratification because you had no agency in the situation. That's also, I
Right.
think, a bad move. It's not as
Sure.
bad as the other move, which is the only reason you're doing this is because you lack willpower and you lack impulse control. That's worse, right? Over moralizing the situation, but totally demoralizing it as well, I think also can be a problem. Less so in the marshmallow test, but more so in other areas where you end up removing agency from people.
Okay. See, I am kind of okay with completely demoralizing it, I
Yeah, I know.
think.
I figured you would be.
Yeah, I think I am. It's weird. I've been reading a lot of Louis Althusser lately. So I've been reading a lot of psychoanalysis and Lacan and Althusser, and obviously did a lot of PhD research on Jean-Paul Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, in which he's looking at the structural conditions of anthropological life, but not just the structural, also the historical as well. So he I think finds this nice balance between trying to retain agency but within conditions that aren't of our choosing, right? As he says, we make history to precisely the exact extent that history makes us, is what Sartre would say. And I dig that, but my reading of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which makes it a little bit different than I think a lot of other people who read it, is that I tend to focus more on the structural. And because I've been reading a lot of Lacan, and because I've been now reading some Althusser, and because I've been reading some Pierre Bourdieu, and I almost texted you yesterday actually and was like, bro, I think I'm just a fucking structuralist, man, because I was reading Althusser, and I did a little reading. I'm reading a text by a guy named Robert Albritton right now, and he's examining what he calls the ontology of capital and whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that he's looking at these various figures, and so he's looking at like Adorno and Althusser and Weber and things like that. And when I get to the chapter on Adorno, I'm like, oh, negative dialectics, yeah, that fits a lot in with my project on Sartre. And then when I get to the chapter on Althusser, I'm like, fuck, man. It seems to really vibe with me, and this idea of agency seems to be something that is far more problematized than I think the position that you're advocating allows. And I still want to retain some notion of agency. I'm not sure yet how to articulate it, but still I think I'm much more, I don't know. I'm much more deterministic than I think I thought I would have been, in a weird way.
That's an interesting way to phrase it. You think you thought you would have
Yeah.
been when?
When I was balls deep in Jean-Paul Sartre research.
In your salad days?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I brought this up because I thought that it's a good, I think, line of demarcation between our two kind of ways of thinking. but I think there's more similarity there than we might give it credit for. Just in that, to me, there's a parallax between basically determinism and freedom, and
Sure.
there's both are true, and although they're contradictory, and so we have to kind of figure out a way to make that work. And Kant is kind of the classic way of trying to figure out how you can have both freedom and determinism at the same time. And for Kant, you have to act under the idea of freedom. It's the only way to make sense of the moral law. And I think I would kind of want my project to be figuring out how to do that, because I think both are true. There's something about experience that denotes the freedom at the heart of it, and the ability to act on judgments and values that we decide and we determine, and for those things to affect our behavior. And at the same time, to understand that all those things are structurally determined in such a way that they can be explained via cause and effect, like anything else in nature would be. And both of those are true. How to sort of figure that out and flesh it out metaphysically is extremely difficult and requires lots and lots of pages and work and hand-wringing. But I, at the very least, when doing like analysis of current events and stuff like that, I do want to include both of those and trying to figure out how they coalesce, rather than just doing one or the other by itself, and I think missing a certain dimension. Although in any cases, one's going to be much more important in the foreground than the other.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And so in this particular case, then, let's say the correction of these new findings moves us away from the over-moralizing factors towards the structural and material factors. And so whether or not we want to place all of our eggs in the causal basket of one side or the other is really secondary. It's more just simply about giving new information to flesh out the descriptive analysis of these particular material phenomena, right?
Right. And so to bring that back to the question which kind of brought this really abstract discussion out of something very concrete, with this discussion of, well, maybe the kids who chose the immediate marshmallow and refused to delay gratification, maybe they're actually being rational in doing this because of decisions X, Y, and Z. I want to be careful about making really grand claims like that, because I don't think that the author necessarily was doing this, but you could take that as being, well, we're going to replace your lack of personal responsibility critique with an actual abundance of personal responsibility explanation. And that, I think, can drift into the moral realm, especially when it's taken in this domain of like millennials being impulsive or lazy or whatever, right? It's like, actually, no, baby boomers are the evil ones because they ruin the economy. So we're just doing what's perfectly rational in our cases. And it's like, well, okay, I want to avoid just battling over which generations are better and which generations have done the most harm to the world, and start talking in these specific cases about the structural factors because they're most relevant in this situation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, whenever the word rational gets used just in general, automatically my skeptical hippo eyes come up out of the water. And I'm looking around, I'm like, really? Rational? Hold on a second here. What do you mean?
Yeah, what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Rational
Are you
according
saying,
to what?
Right, rational as opposed to emotional? I mean, I just did an episode with Wisecracks, Show Me the Meaning, actually, on the movie Inside Out. And we talk about a lot of the research that it was based on. And there is I guess he's a psychologist, cognitive theorist named, oh God, what is it? Racker Keltner is his last name. Dacker Keltner is his name. And he constantly says this one phrase, you are your emotions. You are your emotions. And he's not trying to be overly reductive, but he's trying to overcorrect the idea that somehow there is this battle between like the rational domain of human thought and then the emotional corruption of that rational, natural, or higher order of thinking. But that rather that they are tied up together. To be rational is to be emotional. To be emotional is to be rational. Like when you're calm and you're sitting there making a calm decision about whether or not to delay gratification or not, that's not devoid of emotion. That's not the blocking out the sort of like invasions and pressures that are coming from these emotional impulses that are trying to bastardize your rational thinking process. No, like when you're sitting there calmly, there are still emotions there. As a matter of fact, calmness is a state of emotion, right? It is a type of emotion. It's just a different type of emotion, not better, not necessarily more intense. It just flows in a different direction than anger or fear or excitement or whatever. So, yeah, there's something interesting in that. So whenever people start talking about rationality, automatically I do get a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, that's that classic Heidegger called them moods, right? And you're
Right.
never really de-mooded. You just have different moods.
Mm-mm.
There's a philosophical mood where we call that rational, but it's just a different kind of mood as opposed to another.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um there was one more thing that I was thinking was really interesting about this article, and I'm trying to remember. Give me 2 seconds and let me have a quick think.
That they should have used better candy.
They should have used better candy than a fucking marshmallow, that's for sure.
Yeah, who the hell eats marshmallows by themselves?
Especially those little dinky, because when he says they're the little dinky, the guy that initially conducted the study, he said they're like these little dinky marshmallows. I'm thinking those little ones that go into like hot chocolate. Those little fuckers?
Yeah, they don't taste like anything.
I mean, they're like a little sugary.
I guess if you're a little kid, they have like that biological need for just accumulating massive amounts of sugar. So I get that, I guess. But for me, like as an adult, just a little tiny marshmallow tastes like nothing. I guess the texture is kind of nice because it's all like gooey, but otherwise, they
Yeah.
don't really taste like anything.
What would like make it impossible for you to delay gratification?
Dude, give me like some like Belgian 75% dark chocolate or something.
Oh yeah, that would do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would still be able to delay gratification if it was 5 minutes. But if you did it for like 5 days, I'd be like, no, fuck, give me the chocolate right now, yo.
Well, yeah, for an adult, they would have to adjust the time scale, right? So for you, 5 days. That's right. That's what it would be. It would be 5 days for. Or if you are the type of person that doesn't really consume a lot of sweets anyway, and you don't really, right? You're not like a huge sweet fiend. So for you, it'd have to be like a year.
That's pretty intense, man. I don't think I could even. Yeah, can you even like rationally understand what it means to wait a year for a chocolate bar? I don't think you
I
can.
mean, I took a year off. I took a year off of drinking once.
Were you thinking about what it would be like in a year, though?
You know what's funny? No, I was just like so self-consumed with the commitment that I made to not drinking that it didn't even seem like a possibility that I would drink again. Does that make sense? Like I was so immersed in the commitment. It was very existential in that sense where I just kind of committed. I made the choice. It was a total random choice. I made it and then I just committed to it after a few months and I was like, fuck it, I'm just not going to drink. I'm good. And then it was more about guilt. If I didn't achieve the goal, then I would have felt guilty. Which is then interesting in relation to the sort of authority or the power structures that are impinging upon you, creating that debt and guilt in relation to the image that you've projected, right? Which I think actually fits into this study quite a bit. Oh, that's what it was. It was focusing more, that's what I was thinking about. It was focusing more on this idea that it's about the relation between the authority figures and the child, and how I wonder if there is something that we could say about the difference between individuals in the lower socioeconomic strata versus those in the higher socioeconomic strata and their relation to authority figures and trust. And that was something that hasn't really been looked at. But I thought that was a really interesting angle. This idea that you trust the authority figures because you're accustomed to whatever the sort of sovereign paradigm is in which you live, you're accustomed to it treating you in a particular way. So if you have greater material wealth, you're accustomed to the authority figures sort of being more supportive and being more stimulative of whatever it is that was promised to you. Whereas maybe in the lower socioeconomic tier, you're less willing to trust those authority figures because you have less historical basis on which to base that trust.
So you probably wouldn't really believe necessarily you're going to get the marshmallows in 5 minutes.
Precisely.
It's a cruel trick being played by your older brother or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if that kind of is something that could be teased out in relation to this as well.
Yeah, I'd wonder if they could maybe have kids watch other kids wait 5 minutes and get it and see if that would adjust.
Ooh, interesting.
Avenues for further study.
That's right. In another life, in some alternate dimension, we are social psychologists.
No, I'm definitely not, man. Dude, like formulating hypotheses and predictions and testing them, that sounds like so much work. Holy shit, I just want to like write random shit. That sounds so much better.
Yeah, I
Pontificating
agree.
and speculating is so much better.
It is so much better. Unfortunately, people don't want to read that shit. But this is the goal, man. This is the goal. Like, I went through and I read a Twitter feed, and I try not to usually do this, like an angry political Twitter feed, because it's not good for my positive emotional state. But I went through and I read it the other day, and and I know it's Twitter, and I know there's a character limit, and I know that it's also Twitter, and it's a fucking cesspool for negative affect. But still, I went through, and all I could think to myself was, my God, people are idiots. And I didn't mean this to sound like elitist or something like that, but fuck it. Sometimes if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then maybe I'm a fucking elitist. But God, I felt like such an elitist. Like, these people were having these political discussions, and I was like, this is why we need philosophy education. Because the ability to be able to reason and think and engage with something in nuance just is non-existent. Now, I know part of it obviously has to do with the platform and it doesn't allow for it, but still, man, you can do better than that.
Look at you, Austin,
gotta,
getting all moralistic on us.
I know, man. Fuck.
You should repent and pray to Althusser.
I should. I will. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go read some Althusser in a minute. I will. I'm sorry, Louis. Don't choke me.
Oh, shit. That was dark, man. All right. We should leave this on the table before you end up getting us like an explicit rating on iTunes.
We already have one.
Oh, shit. Well, then well deserved.
All right, sweet. So let's move on to our next segment. It is the Sticky Leaves, and this is the segment where one of us gets to talk about what it is that is giving us meaning in a life that is often devoid of meaning. Troy, what is giving you meaning this week? What is your sticky leaf?
So you're well aware of this because I messaged you about it when it happened last week. But the NBA has been on a pretty great roll in the last week or so of being incredibly entertaining. I don't know we talk about basketball too much on here. I say that all the time, but this is necessary because it's such a great story. In addition to the NBA Finals, like the pinnacle of the NBA season of basketball year is happening right now. An even more entertaining story is happening in the background. And here's what's going on. The Ringer, which is a publication, a sports publication run by Bill Simmons. If you remember, he's a pretty famous kind of basketball and sports, not really a journalist so much as just a pontificator and a writer.
Is he a pundit? Is he a pundit?
I guess he kind of is a pundit, huh? They have sports pundits now. It's pretty sad. And so his company, The Ringer, they have been doing this investigative journalistic piece for a while now, and they published it. It's called The Curious Case of Brian Colangelo and the Secret Twitter Account. And here's the basic details behind what happened. So Brian Colangelo is the general manager. He's the head decision maker, basketball decision maker of the Philadelphia 76ers. And the 76ers have had a pretty interesting and unique last several years. They were sort of famous for the tanking phenomenon about 5 years ago. And this is where a team would sort of trade all of their good players away and sign no veteran players to larger contracts and have just a bunch of young players who are inexperienced and bad and lose on purpose so they could end up getting the highest draft picks and get the best players from college. This has happened in baseball as well. The Houston Astros were kind of the 76ers of baseball. They had a number of number one picks in a row, and the Astros won the World Series last year. So the Sixers did this, and it came at a lot of fire because they were losing on purpose, it seemed, and they had a lot of bad players, and it just seemed like a kind of a blight on the NBA, purposefully losing.
Hold on, Troy. Are they delaying gratification?
Yeah, exactly. They were definitely doing that. It was a rational decision, some would say. And so they did this, and eventually their GM at the time, who was Sam Hinkie, he got fired. He became the sacrificial lamb for this whole thing. And the NBA commissioner himself put, or I guess suggested, but really everyone thinks kind of put Brian Colangelo, who has a long history in the NBA, and his father, Jerry Colangelo, runs the USA Olympic team for basketball, in his place to kind of reform the team. And as soon as this happened, the Sixers all of a sudden became good, not because their new GM was great or anything, but because the players they had tanked for and got from college finally matured and were now awesome. And so the team's really good. They were one of the best teams in the league this year, yada, yada. Now, the great part of the story is that this guy, Brian Colangelo, who comes in and basically reaps all the rewards of the previous regime's success, has been exposed as in possibly being involved with a bunch of shadowy, anonymous Twitter accounts. And these Twitter accounts are bashing his current players and some of his former players, so far as to expose medical issues with the players that are not public knowledge, and that would be grounds for lawsuits if someone on the team was exposing these things, because they could affect the career earnings of the player. And even better, have defended the fashion choices of one Brian Colangelo himself, who is renowned for wearing very, very high collars on his shirts. And when someone criticized him and said that the collar was too large, one of these anonymous Twitter accounts said, it's a normal collar, find a new slant, which is now actually in the NBA basketball Twitter lexicon, find a new slant. So if you say that to someone who knows about basketball, they'll be very happy that you're on the inside. What happened was, and the story is so great, it's basically like a conspiracy thriller. Some anonymous person sent information regarding these several different Twitter accounts, which appear to be unrelated on the first glance, and said they think that it's Brian Colangelo who's running these accounts based upon artificial intelligence analysis, which is total horseshit. Total horseshit. Someone was in the know. The Ringer gets these accounts, right? They do some investigation. They find that there's some weird things happening here. And so they message the 76ers, the team themselves, and say, hey, we have 2 accounts here that look like they might be being run by someone in the organization. Can you confirm whether or not Brian Colangelo is running them? Meanwhile, there were actually 5 accounts, not 2. So they just said 2, just to see what would happen. And as soon as that happened, within 30 minutes, all 5 accounts went dark. The 2 that were mentioned and 3 more. So the Ringer did this on purpose to see if actually all 5 accounts were run by the same person and not just 2. So all 5 accounts go dark. The Sixers call back and say, well, one of those accounts, the least egregious one, is run by Brian Colangelo, but the other one is not, and of course not confirming anything about the other 3. The Ringer takes this as basically proof that someone in the organization is doing this. They ask the 76ers spokesman who knows about this information, who could have possibly done this, taken all 5 accounts dark without actually saying that, just trying to find out who would have had the information. And the person says it's only Brian Colangelo and the person themselves, the spokesman. So basically, you can do your deduction and figure out that it's Colangelo himself that's doing this. Now, a couple days later, this story is just so incredible and nuanced and complicated. A couple days later, someone finds out that some of the tweets from one of these accounts was tweeting during media availability, where Brian Colangelo was on stage talking to the press and couldn't have been tweeting at the same time. So they figure out, actually, it's very possible his wife is the one who's running these accounts. And if you read the tweets thinking that it's his wife running the accounts, defending his fashion choices and things like that, it all of a sudden becomes even more incredible. And it's so bad that the 76ers are running an internal investigation right now, and pretty much everybody thinks he's going to get fired. Because even if it's his wife doing it, no player would ever trust this guy again, because they've outed all this medical information about players that shouldn't be known to the public. And it's just wonderful, man, because, no one's really a victim in this story. Like, you can't really feel bad for anybody. Because maybe a few millionaires are going to make a few less, or a few fewer millions. Is that what you would say? Fewer millions than they would otherwise. And that's kind of unfair, and that sucks, right? And Colangelo is a comically kind of inept figure, and if his wife is doing this all of a sudden takes like a really, reality show bent to the whole thing. But like, it's really entertaining and interesting, and no one's really like being hurt here. So it's like you can fully embrace it and enjoy it and not feel bad about it. And that's kind of the ideal for sports, I think, right? Like, LeBron's going to probably get his ass beat in the finals, and you don't have to feel bad about it because he has millions and millions of dollars and he's super famous and he's like the greatest player of all time. So he can lose, and you can take joy in that and him being trounced and then not feel bad about it and know that he's going to come back next year and want to have even more vengeance against the Warriors, right? Sports should be this. It should be a spectacle where you can enjoy, you can have like what did Nietzsche call it? Like the cruelty ritual that we crave so much as human
Mm.
beings. You can have that and it also not be like immoral because no one's really hurt in the end. That's why I love this story.
Now, how are the players reacting? Because I saw that Joel Embiid was responding. So
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. So,
yeah, because Joel Embiid, yeah, I mean he's legendary on Twitter anyway. Like he's just legendary as a figure. Like
as a
remember
human
after the
being.
game, the announcer said he was recovering from an injury once and was like, "So how are you? How are you feeling right now?" He's like, "I'm at about 69%."
And it was a female reporter
Fucking-
too, so
And it was a female reporter. Fucking
yeah. Embiid, he went to Kansas University for 1 year before going to NBA, right? And he's from the Cameroon, I think, maybe somewhere in Africa, right? And he joked around with his Kansas teammates when he first got there, straight from Africa, and he grew up like middle class and like went to a nice school and speaks fluent English, and he's educated and all this stuff, right? And he joked around with his teammates that he like had killed a lion with a spear and like run around in a loincloth and stuff. And they believed him for a while, and then he just told them that he was bullshitting. So he's
Yeah.
a comic legend for sure. And he was one of the players
Yeah.
who Colangelo or whatever these Twitter accounts had kind of committed defamation towards or whatever by exposing medical information and questioning his dedication to the game and his talent and stuff like that. And so he immediately tweeted out something to the effect of like he thinks that he tweeted out to one of these Twitter accounts that they're kind of stupid, and then jokingly said later that he doesn't believe the accounts. He believes his GM, but if they're actually correct, then this is really bad. Basically, being like,
Right.
dude, you're fucked,
Yeah.
but without getting in trouble.
It's so funny that NBA Twitter is a subculture online. Like Black Twitter or, I don't know, fucking alt-right Twitter or communism Twitter or left Twitter, whatever. It's funny that there are these little hashtag subcultures that exist. So what's the saying again about the caller? If you say this, that it's become a
Oh
tagline?
yeah, find a new slant.
Find a new slant. It's amazing that only exists because of NBA Twitter, which is a thing, and it's actually a part of culture that if you aren't on Twitter and you don't understand what it is, then you're actually left out to a relatively significant part of pop cultural life.
Yeah, it's so cool, right? Because I don't know other sports all that well, but I know baseball, for instance, doesn't really have this because most
It doesn't.
baseball fans tend to be older, and so basketball has this like strong cultural force behind it. The players are all free to express themselves politically, even as you saw LeBron and the Warriors and stuff doing this year against Trump, and they can express themselves through fashion and music and whatever else, and they can have personalities. They don't have to be bland like baseball players are, where like having no fun is a virtue in baseball, right? For a lot of people. And so, yeah, it's part of the culture that's really interesting and fun and adds a sort of gravitas to it when you actually have the winning and losing and the basketball playing as well. There's a whole, like, you feel like there's actually more going on there because these people have personalities.
Right. Yeah. No, that is good fun, man. It's funny, too, because it's actually less about... I wonder if there's, like, an interesting sociological angle to this, right? This idea of creating shadow accounts. Because Kevin Durant did it, too. Didn't he get busted for having... He was, like, defending himself in people's mentions when they were critical of him from a shadow account.
Yeah, and then he accidentally tweeted from his regular account exposing the fact that he was using this shadow account.
Right. Yeah, it is
so
funny.
petty, man.
Hey, do you have a shadow account?
Dude, if someone out there is criticizing you, Austin, questioning like your fashion choices and your tattoos and shit, that might be a shadow account by me. Who knows?
Maybe I already am a shadow account. See, this is where we can get Baudrillardi in here, and it's all shadow accounts.
It's all simulacrum accounts.
That's right. Exactly.
What would your shadow account even say, though? What do you like secretly like really addict to everybody and not like nice and kind and nuanced? I don't even know what you would do.
I don't know. Yeah,
like you get your aggression out through shadow accounts or something.
Yeah, I just want to like fight people.
You're like a Chapo guy.
That's my shadow account.
In your shadow accounts.
Yeah, I am. I'm Matt, whatever his last name is. I forget it right now, but that is my shadow account. I just forgot. I'm tired. I haven't had my coffee yet, but that really is me. I am one of the Chapo guys.
Hey, can you share some of that 100K a month that they're making then?
I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to do that because of contractual obligations.
Yeah, fucking capitalist.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode. You can go ahead and email us if you have any questions or anything like that at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Twitter, owls_at_dawn. And we're going to have that episode with Heidi Matthews in a couple weeks. We're going to talk about the Me Too movement and feminism and things like that in a couple weeks, probably. She was just sick this week. And then next week, I think we're going to get back into our book club, right? With going on to part 1 of Void Universalism. Is that right? We're doing that next week?
Right, part 1 of Void Universalism. It's 2 chapters. We're going to do that for the next book club.
Okay, cool. And anything else that I'm forgetting? Oh, yeah, if you can head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review, that actually really helps with the metrics and the analytics for driving more people to the cast.
Yeah, you better do that, otherwise we're going to have to tank and get the best draft picks for our next podcast.
I know. Trust the process.
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.